Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A gute Woche and a kosher and freilichen Pesach. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya, being that Pesach is literally beginning in 2 days. We'll also share a few thoughts about Pesach according to Chassidus. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Shalom, and Rabbi Yoel HaKoyen Khan Olav Shalom. It is also in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel and HaKoyen and Risha Katz Le'erich Yom V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. And especially in honor of our Eden, men, women, and children in Eretz Yisrael, who are in a challenging situation with latest events, and in general, Hashem should protect them. Hine Yonim v'Layush Hashem Yisrael, especially in Eretz Asher Eini Hashem Alekecha Bo, Bereshis Hashana v'ad Achris Shana, and especially those that are Meiser Nefesh on the front lines, protecting and defending, literally sacrificing their lives to help and protect the innocents. And Hashem should finally bring the end to this Golus, and as we march into Pesach, should be Benisan Nigalu, Benisan Asidin Li Goel, only Geula and Sholem Ba'aretz forever and ever. So before we get into Tanya, let's just say a few words about Pesach, Inyana Diyema. So let's begin the obvious question. We say, my Chazal say, and we say it in the Haggadah, B'chol der v'der chayev adam liras esatz mikilhu yotzim mitzrayim. In every generation, a person has to envision as if they left Egypt. The Baal HaTanya adds B'chol yem v'yem, not just B'chol der v'der, every day. We have Takas Chiris Yitzis Mitzrayim. In the Sheish Chiris we remember, and in so many mitzvahs, so many prayers, Yitzis Mitzrayim is mentioned so often. The question is, why is it such a core fundamental principle that we have to actually envision? Many of us will never be in Egypt. We never will have been in Egypt. Will not go to Egypt. Why do we have to envision? You could say you have to remember what happened to Aviseinu, to our parents, our ancestors, that when they left Mitzrayim, which we commemorate and we recreate in the Seder Shel Pesach. The answer lies in the fundamental principle, B'chlal, about Yom Tevim in general, and Shabbos, and in general dates, even your birthday. Hayomim ha'ela niskarim v'nasim, the Megillah says. These days are niskarim, are remembered, and nasim. Ask the Arizal, what is that v'nasim? It says niskarim, they're remembered. So it's brought Nisfarim, the name of that Arizal, because they're not just remembered, they're recreated. Meaning time in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism, is a spiral. It's not a river of past, present, and future. Just like every week returns back to, that's why we count Sunday, day 1. Why not just count 7 days, then day 7, 8, 9, 10, just go on. Every week starts again from the number 1. So Chassidus explains, because time is a cycle, a spiral. And you go through Sundays Chesed, and Monday is Gvura, and Friday is Yisod, and Shabbos is Malchus. And then the cycle begins again. In other words, time returns back to that point, that energy. Kol yema v'yema over Davidita, says the Zohar. Every day has its unique energy, and that energy is a cycle, it's a structure like any structure. The same as the monthly structures, the same as with the annual structure. So every year Rosh Hashanah, every year Pesach, the events that happened back then are happening right now, the same energy. And we're channeling it into our lives. So we're not just remembering something that happened in the past, not just Niskarim, it's Nasim. And that's what it means. Right now, Yitzis Mitzrayim is happening and you have to experience it. So how do you explain that? And the answer is, that is through understanding the very word Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is not just a translation of a geographical country called Egypt. Mitzrayim comes from the word Meitzorim v'gvulim. Boundaries and constraints, like Meitzar, constraints. Mitzrayim represents Kol HaGolis Nikru Al Shem Mitzrayim. That's what it says. All the Golos Nikrois Al Shem Mitzrayim. Why? What's the connection? What's Golos Bavel have to do with Golos Edom and Golos Mitzrayim? Because they all are an extension of Mitzarim V'Gvulim. Mitzarim V'Gvulim are things that constrain us, that limit us. Physically, the actual enslavement as it was in the Avdus, Avodim Ayinu Be'eretz Mitzrayim, but it also Avdus is psychological and emotional and spiritual. We say, even in Eretz Yisrael, he didn't say that. Why? Because it's not about just the physical location. It's a spiritual state of displacement, of dissonance, when we don't feel connected. As soon as Adam and Chava ate from Eitz Hadas was the first dissonance, a disconnect. That's why Hashem said to them, Ayeko, said to Adam, Ayeko, where are you? He didn't know where he was. I don't recognize you. You've disconnected from me. It's like someone sitting in your presence and physically, and you ask them, where are you? If you see them sitting there. You're asking, where, you're not present. I don't feel your presence. You've wandered away. Your mind, your heart, your feelings, your soul is somewhere else. And that's what Hashem was saying. It says in Sfarim that an animal will never attack a human being because they see the Tzelem Elokim. And they're afraid of that, the divine image. They see B'Peil, we do see, God forbid, animals do attack humans. Daniel, B'Neva and Arayas, and the lions then was not attacked because they saw the Tzelem Elokim. So the answer is because the Tzelem Elokim can be concealed through Avedas. And Avedas is the opposite of a mitzvah. A mitzvah is a connection. Aveda means from the word Havarim, Reshus L'Reshus, is a disconnection. It's a displacement, a disalignment, a dissonance. So once the face, or once the divine image is concealed, the animals don't recognize. Where are you? And that's our job, is to find out who we are and reveal that Tzelem Elokim within us. Mitzrayim limits that, like all the confinements, fears, insecurities, inhibitions, anything that traps you is the Mitzrayim of your lives. So when we relive Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Seder, what we should be doing is envisioning what is going on in my life now that's a Mitzrayim. And then we draw upon what happened in Mitzrayim 3,336 years ago and say, okay, what do we learn from that for my Yetzias Mitzrayim today? So Mitzrayim continues in our lives even after we actually physically left Mitzrayim. That Golus is over with and will never be Avodim again, as the Maral says. But we still have to deal with the Avdus, or what the Lashon of the Rambam in Sof Perek Beis, the end of the second chapter in Hilchos Gedushin in Mishnah Torah Yad HaChazakah, where he says, Yitzrei hu sha'ansei. Your Yetzer Hara can trap you and can compel you to do something. It's against your own will, because the will of a Yid is always to do mitzvahs, as the Rambam says there. So the Yetzer Hara is a form of a Meitzar. As a matter of fact, the Yetzer Hara is compared to Chometz. So Pesach is all about transcendence, of getting beyond these boundaries. And that's why we have all the mitzvahs, starting from Matzah, and all the 15 steps of the Seder Shal Pesach. Each one is another step in helping us free ourselves from all Meitzarim V'Gvulim, Begashmis and Beruchnis. So may this Pesach Taka be one that is both freeing Geula Pratis and of course a Geula Klolis, Kimeit Seischem Eretz Mitzrayim, Aren and Neflois, that we should see wonders today in our personal lives and our collective lives, and of course in the entire world with the Geula Amitis V'Ashleim. So that's the Pesach, a quick summary of one point. Obviously, there's so much more we could say. Magid v'agadat al levincha, you could spend all night and more than a night talking about this. But I wanted to just, to begin with that. And with that, let's move to Tanya. Tanya is absolutely a formula for Yetzias Mitzrayim, to get out of the Mitzarim v'Gvulim, of the neshama that comes into a physical body trapped in it, and a nefesh habamis, an animal soul, and we're learning how we free ourselves from that. But not just free, transform. So we finished the 18th Perek Chai, and we're now up to Perek Yutes. So as a small introduction to Perek Yutes, 19th Perek, which is a continuation of Perek Yutes, let's go back to the central themes that began in chapter 18. What essentially we have until now, till chapter 18, that is, till the end of chapter 17, was the discussion about the divine soul and the animal soul, yes, and about their personality, divine versus animal, and then about the battle between the two, and how that battle is dealt with the tzaddik, the Rasha, and the Beinoni, and how we, through our Aveda of contemplation, using the faculties of the divine soul and the garments of the divine soul, can conquer the faculties and garments of the animal soul. That the machshava dibur ma'aser of a person should be controlled by the divine. Even for someone who cannot eliminate their animal soul, like a Beinoni, midas kol adam acharei kol adam yimshach. And what was the concept essentially? It's up to you. It's your work through contemplation, his bonus, and his bonus that leads to a seridus, an awakening, a birthing of Ava v'yira, Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, which is the foundation of all Torah mitzvahs. And there are different ways and different levels of how a person does that. Some people can actually awaken fiery, passionate midas, emotions. Some can do fiery, so it's talumis libe. At least you feel that it's worthy of loving God. But what still remains before chapter 18 needs to be explained. What about someone who can't even reach that level of emotion altogether? And we say, Korav elecha dover me'ed beficha ubelvovcha la'asese. Not just beficha, not just la'asese, levovcha. And adover me'ed, Korav elecha dover me'ed. So in chapter 18, Alter Rebbe says, let's now take this further and explain there's another part of a human being. What we discussed earlier was that there's a divine soul that each of us is endowed with by our very birthright. Speaks in Perek Beis, with the divine faculties in Perek Gimel, and the Levushim in Dalet Hey rather. Then there's another part, which is the divine animal soul, which he speaks about in chapters Vav Zayin Aches, 6, 7, and 8. Then the battle. But there's another aspect, which really comes back to chapter 2. That divine soul that you have within you, which is because Bonim Atam Lashem Alekechem, like a ben, that has the moyach ha'av within him, a very part chelik elekam emal mamish, as he explained there relatively at length. So he has the that brings to yet another faculty that we have within us, the dormant love we call ava misuteris. This ava misuteris is not totally an aveda. We're born with it. Till now he was talking about an ava that is birthed through aveda. Now we're talking about an ava that we are born with. But it's innate, it's dormant within us. And needs to be brought out and expressed. And that's what he begins to explain. That explains how everybody, even someone who cannot, like he said, Misha Daitik Tzadin, is unable to contemplate, even to create the level of talumas libe, that it's worthy of loving God, everyone, and Korav Ma'id, the diuk in Ma'id, very much so, because he has Ava Mesuteres. And where does he have it from? Yerushalayim Aviseinu. But to explain what that means, Alter Rebbe broke it into 4 points. You could say, it's not 4 questions necessarily, but 4 things that he wants to explain. One was, to go back to the language in Perek Yud Ches. He said 4 things to understand. He said like this. We need to first understand and preface Sheirish Avazu. What is the root of this Ava? The root of the Ava that's born through contemplation, the root is Bina, contemplation, the seichel of a person. But here we're saying it's not coming from a person's effort. So what is the root of it? Where does it come from? The Inyana, what is its very personality? Is defining property. What is Inyana? Ve'echi Yerushalanu, and how? And why is it our inheritance? Because you can inherit the money from your parents. You can inherit their belongings. But if a parent, for example, has a good friend, do you inherit that? Not necessarily. So how is this Ava, Mesuteres, inherited from the Ovis? And finally, the Eich Nichel Bogam Tchilu. So you could say it's questions, because he says Eich. So you can say, by the last two he says, how is it a inheritance to us? And does it include chilu also yira, reverence? So on Perek Yud Ches he addressed 2 and 3. The Shadish, 1 and 3. He explained, my mistake. He explained 1 and 3, Shadish Avazu, and explained Echi Yerushalonu. He actually went the other order. How is it Yerusha? Let's start with that. Because what they give us is not the Ava. They give us, because the Ovis were Hein Markova, their deep bittel, as he said, that passed on. Because Hein Markova, Al Kain Zochu, they merited Lahamshich Naran Libneihem. So Hashem blessed and gave them the merit that they don't just give their possessions, but also the very nefesh, ruach, and neshama to their children ad olam, forever. And where does that neshama come from? The nefesh, ruach, and neshama from the Esser Sfiras, which then leads us to the second point, which is where the shadish is. The shadish, he says, is from chokhmah. Chokhmah shebenefesh is a unique faculty within us. It's not the faculty of contemplating that gives birth to midas, like we talked about in the beginning, about Ava that comes from our effort. Chokhmah is the keli for Erein Sof, Kayachma, the bitl of Chokhmah. That is what's passed on by the Ovis through Nefesh Ruach Neshama, because it comes from all the Sfiras Salyenis, which all encompass each other, and they all originate in Chokhmah, all the way to Chokhmah Datzilus, which in turn, Shedabay, like he explains clearly, that in Chokhmah resides Erein Sof Baruch Hu, and as a result, every neshama has an Erein Sof within it. That Erein Sof is indeed the Ava Mesuteres. And that's why he says, even a Kal Shebekalim, everyone will be Meiser Nefesh when push comes to shove. So there you have the answer to the question of how it's a Yerusha, and what is the root of where it's rooted in Chokhmah. But Chokhmah not as Mokar HaSeichel. Well, I should correct myself. He says Chokhmah is Mokar HaSeichel, but it's the L'mayla Mebina, because Chokhmah L'mayla Ma'avon V'Asogah, so it's the Mokar to Seichel. So it's the bridge, the interface between that which is higher than Seichel. Kayachma, Masha Eina Musig movement, which is the Erein Sof, that's Mislabish, less Machshava Twisrek, like Chol Yisrael, everyone. Afila Noshim Ba'amoretz, Ma'minim Ba'Hashem, that's the Amunah, L'mayla Ma'adas, that's the root. So Chokhmah is the interface, and from there, as a Mokar HaSeichel will then extend itself into the faculties, all the faculties, Mispashet, will extend and Mispashet into all the faculties of the person. So there you have, as I said, the answer to Shadish. Number 1, the first point Alter Rebbe said, and the third point, Yerusha. In Perek Yud Tes, he's going to explain now the other two. Number 1, which was what is in Yonah. What is the properties? What is the identity? What is the personality? The defining properties of this Chokhmah. In other words, how does this Chokhmah Shebenefesh, which has the Ein Sof within it, how does it manifest? So we do know that it manifests in the concept of Ava Mesuteres. But what does that mean? How does that play itself out? And that's what we're going to learn now. And then later in the Perek, he's going to begin also to explain why it also includes reverence at the end of the Perek. So let's learn now inside Perek Yud Tes. And he says again, Lo teisves bir. See this expression used quite a few times. Lo teisves bir. Further explanation. Which means he's not just explaining the other 2 points, he's explaining in general further explanation on this idea. What idea? We're talking now about a new concept. The concept of the dormant love that we all have within us by birth. Without any Aveda. Aveda is necessary to bring it forth, as we discussed. So it doesn't contradict at all what we learned earlier that you need Aveda, because Aveda is ultimately what internalizes, and the whole purpose is not just to be born and have Ava Mesuteres and do nothing about it, is to draw it out. In addition to everything we learned earlier about the contemplation that gives birth to Avos Hashem. So when you have both the Ava Mesuteres and you fan those flames that are inherent within you, and the contemplation that we learned earlier of the Beinoni, that altogether leads to a full-blown, a full-dimensional Eved Helakim, a person who's serving God. So now he's going to say, L'teisvis bir, which is going to explain the inyana of Ava Tivus HaMesuteres. So Ava, the very word love, means you love something. You can love anything. You can love things that are neutral. You can love things that are inappropriate. Here, of course, we're talking about loving God. So how does that manifest? What is the inyan of Avas Ava, this Ava that he's discussing right here? That's what he's going to be addressing now. So he says like this. Tzorech levayet heitiv. We need to understand this. We need to understand well what it says, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom. Mashakosov Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom. That's what he's going to address here. Okay. Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom means that what we are talking about earlier, we said that every Yid is ready to be Meser Nefesh to Hashem. That was the Teichen that he said. Where does that come from? It comes from this Ava Mesuteres, which is going to now be understood by understanding what does it mean that Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, that the flame of Hashem, God's candle, is the human being's soul. So what we have here is that this human soul is compared to a candle. Now we already learned about the neshama before. We learned the neshama is a chelik elikamim al mamish in chapter 2. In chapter 18 we learned how this nefesh ruach neshama, the neshama has in it ava mesuteres, meaning the Ein Sof that radiates within chochmah shebenefesh. But now we have a tangible example of how this plays itself out. This is the candle of God, God's candle. This is from Mishlei, Proverbs, Chof Zayin, 20:27. Pirush explains the Alter Rebbe. She Yisrael hakruyim Adam. That's Nishma Sodom. And you see here again the Alter Rebbe's meticulous ability, the meticulous style to dissect every word of a pasuk. She says, she Yisrael hakruyim Adam, that the souls of Israel, which are referred to as Adam, this is from the Gemara in Yevamis, Samach Aleph, 61a. Nishmosim hi lemoshel ke'er haner. Why does he bring Hakruyim Adam? For the obvious reason, because he's talking about an Nefesh Elikis, which belongs to Ayid, to Neshama Vayid. So he says, this is like an example comparable to the flame of a candle. What do you see with the flame of a candle? He says, Shemisnaneya Tomid. It's constantly flickering. I read the full phrase, sorry. Shemisnaneya Tomid, constantly flickering, but he continues. Lamaila Betive. That's the full thing. I didn't read it properly. By nature, it's continuously flickering upward. So flickering is one thing that's constantly moving. But the key is that by nature, it's continuously, tomid. That's the first thing that you see with a flame. Every other object in existence is stationary. I mean, there are objects that have certain properties. Water also moves. But a fire has this unique flickering upward all the time. That's the very nature of a ner. So by understanding the nature of the ner, and this is classic Siddur Chabad that the Alter Rebbe is introducing us, taking a pasuk and using a physical example, mipsari echzeh lekah, from my flesh I behold God, or from natural things around us, which God created. Why did God create a candle? In order to give us an example of what our neshama is like. And perhaps that's why you find, not perhaps, that neiros are such a fundamental thing, the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, Shabbos candles, Yom Tov candles, in so many different situations, and has a unique role. So he's saying that this mashal of the Neir that's constantly flickering upward is going to explain to us, what is the Inyan is going to explain to us the very nature of the neshama, which in this context is the chokhmah of that carries the Eir Ein Sof into the person. How does it express itself? By a constant flickering upward. Now, what does that mean? So he continues. Now, what's the reason? Why does the flame flicker upward all the time? In other words, why does it defy gravity like nothing else? So science will give you its explanation. The Alter Rebbe is going to give the deeper explanation. Because a fire's flame, chefetz beteva, lifrod mahapsila. It desires and is naturally inclined to separate itself, to detach itself from the wick. In other words, when you actually look at it, you actually feel that. You feel that tension. That the flame is like licking the air, reaching upward, in a way trying to escape or leave the wick. We talked before about mitzarim v'gvulim. So you see from that this is, and where does it want to go? Where does this flame want to go? Ulidvok, ulidovek, b'shar shelamayla. So to connect with its root above. B'yeseda esha klali, in the core element of fire, shetach is galgal hayereach, which is below the moon's orbit. So even physically, the way it's expressed in the classical model of astronomy and science, as the Rambam explains, that divides into two parts. There's a terrestrial part of existence, which you talk about the four elements: Eish, Ruach, Mayim, Afer, fire, wind, or air, water, and earth. And then there's the celestial, which is like, what is its root? Those four elements, those four archetypes, or rooted in four archetypes, and that we call, you say, the Eish HaKlali. We're talking about Eish now, not the other three elements. You say the Eish HaKlali, core element of fire, which is not necessarily fire. It's an archetype of fire. Higher, even in higher spheres, is the root is in Gvura, the fire. Gvura is not a physical thing, it's a spiritual entity. But in this case, we're talking about this archetype called, you say the Eish HaKlali. So the fire below is reaching toward its source. That's what it's doing. So gravity affects things on the terrestrial level, on a physical level. But here we're talking about something that wants to defy gravity and reach upward. That's why the flame is constantly flickering to reach that. Says the Alter Rebbe. As stated in Eitz Chaim, which is in section 50, chapter 8. And as I said, this is brought in Medrash and the Rambam and Medrash and other places in Kabbalah. So this is the beginning of understanding Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, but we'll still stop here due to time limits. We'll continue learning what this nature is in the Ner, and then how we apply that to a neshama, that every neshama has that flame within it. And we're talking about the natural components of the neshama, not through Aveda, that we're born with this. So with that, we shall stop here. Wish everyone a kosher and freilich and Pesach. We'll be here. We're here every Motzei Shabbos. So until the next year, everyone have a very liberating and meaningful Pesach. TanyaApplied.com is where you can find this and all previous programs.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.